Proponents of what's called Kemetic yoga claim that the practice of yoga actually predates the detailed and standardized source texts developed in India, where it is commonly believed that yoga has its origins. Despite Egypt having its own uniquely developed spiritual tradition and metaphysical path, teachers of Kemetic yoga stake claim on the standardized detachment process called yoga, expounded and recorded by what we know of as historically Indian-bodied adepts. Could this be true? Could it be that yoga originated in Africa? Justifiably, right off the bat, one might think that this could be yet another attempt to exploit the already exhausted yoga market. There's a yoga for everything and for everyone. And now there's also a yoga specifically for Black people. And not just for Black people, but developed by Black peoples in ancient Kemet, which is ancient Egypt. The message is clear. Yet the assertion, this claim, deserves a deeper look. I am personally interested in both of these cultures, ancient Egypt and ancient India, and I have studied them independent of one another. And as a younger, less informed yoga teacher, I even introduced my students to the Smai Twai, Smaitwai, which I learned was a term African teachers used to identify a yoga-like, questionably yoga-like practice performed by the ancient Egyptians. The words Smai Twai are from the Medu Neter language, the ancient Egyptian language. I showed students the few postures I had seen from carvings and hieroglyphs. I had yet to do a deep study back then. I didn't know what I was doing, and didn't realize that Kemetic yoga teachers actually claimed that yoga was not even from India at all. I tried a lot of things back then in my classes before I was more informed. But now, after arduous research, I can tell you firsthand that the information on genuine ancient Egyptian practices are not easy to pin down. There are plenty of books and classes available where the teacher has interpreted or reinterpreted things themselves, added things from other cultures, and then offer it up as being genuinely ancient Egyptian. So I want to tell you what my research questions were as I'm going into this. Here's what I was questioning. Was a comparable, psychologically detailed, step-by-step system for spiritual liberation purposes developed in ancient Egypt? In addition to this question, who's the Kemetian Patanjali, and what are the Kemetic 8 limbs? Next question, what are the original sources of an early Egyptian step-by-step liberation process that is so comparable to the Indian yoga, which was standardized and immortalized in numerous source texts and traceable to Indian authors, that they are interchangeable? Next, what was the name of this practice that yoga used to be called in ancient Egypt? And lastly, why don't the Kemetic yoga teachers exclusively use the Medu Neter language and terminology instead of using the very dissimilar Sanskrit language and terminology? And so here's how I looked for the answers to these questions. These are my sources. First source is the actual Medu Neter language itself, also known as the hieroglyphs. I used the Pert Haru, also known as the Egyptian Book of the Dead. This is very, very important. If you want to understand ancient Egyptians, ancient Kemetians, the Egyptian Book of the Dead is where it's at. I used the pyramid texts, the coffin texts, and the resurrection text. I used the sarcophagus tomb carvings and art. I did the study of the actual Kemetic process, which includes Shemzu, which is deity worship, and the Shethat Neter, which are the 4 principles 4 principles, and they are that number 1, the netter, the supreme being, is one and alone, manifesting everywhere and in all beings in the forms of gods and goddesses. The second principle is that a lack of righteousness brings fetters to the personality, and these fetters cause ignorance of the divine. The third principle is that devotion to the divine leads to freedom of the fetters of Set. Set is one of their deities. Fourth principle, the practice of the Shedi disciplines leads to knowing oneself and the divine. This is called being true of speech. The Shedi disciplines are the study of the wisdom teachings, devotion to God, behaving with righteousness, and meditation. Okay? I also studied lectures by Ra-Un Nefer Aman, Kemet University Ancient Egyptian Philosophy Study website compiled by Dr. Muata Ashby, as well as many of his books, classes, and lectures. Numerous online groups, blogs, and websites devoted to Kemetic yoga. My own in-depth study, including scientific and meditation research on the science of melanin. And my main primary teachers are Dr. Philip Valentine and Sister Deborah Ma'at. So on the surface, Kemetic yoga may sound like just another thing attaching itself to the highly marketable word yoga. Unfortunate it is that so many different supposed yogas are being offered by pseudo-studios with teachers ignorant, pseudo-teachers ignorant of even the basic source texts of yoga. It's amazing. And I was doing it myself at one time. By now, we're all conditioned to really not take yoga seriously and to just accept whatever the new thing is. All the Ananda yogas, Ashtangi yoga, power yoga, holy yoga, beer yoga, goat yoga, trapeze yoga, yin yoga, hot yoga, wine yoga, pot yoga, naked yoga, yoga for cancer, yoga for weight loss, yoga for golfers, yoga for whatever. But look closer at Kemetic yoga, and you'll quickly note it is marketed primarily to African American Black people by American Black people. Teachers offer reassurances to their Black students that what they are doing is African in nature and origin. But is it? They teach that the Western white people, they say this, I've heard it, that the Western white people doing crude stretches reflect what Indian yoga is focused on. They say that Hatha yoga is merely a physical practice, and that instead, in Kemetic classes, the focus is on breathing and meditation. This is the claim. Kemetic yoga teachers teach their students certain physical positions that mimic depictions of gods and goddesses in hieroglyphs. And the thought is that it's going to bring them closer toward divine consciousness. If they get into these positions that they see these gods and goddesses in the hieroglyphs, that they'll be closer to the divine. I'm not sure if Kemetic yoga teachers have studied or ever even heard of the source text called the Hatha Yoga Pradipika. I've never heard them mention it at all or seen it in the writings. It is one of the 3 main source texts for yoga, the other 2 being the Yoga Sutras and the Bhagavad Gita. With even minimal study, it is obvious that Hatha yoga is very complex and certainly not just crude postures. Therefore, white people doing pseudo yoga in America is not a reflection of what Indian yoga is, as it is found in the authoritative books, or from what we observe from the practices and lifestyles of learned yogis and yoginis. People educated on yoga know that the exercise fad in America calling itself yoga is a farce. Kemetic yoga teachers show a few paintings of humans in stretch positions and claim these show yoga started in Egypt. Yet physical postures are normal for basic human health. And humans have surely been stretching since our very beginnings. It's instinctive. A couple stretched depictions without any contextual elaboration on them is no reason to identify them as those Indian asanas or postures. I was unable to find source material on the postural instruction for Kameshan yoga anywhere. There was nothing in the Medu Nutter, there was nothing in the texts that would give instruction for how to execute the postures. In addition, Physical exercises done for the sake of the goals set out in Indian yoga are only one of the 8 limbs required to complete the system. And speaking of the 8 limbs, let's address Patanjali. This is a really important thing for us to address. Most of the Kemetic teachers I learned from at once use the limbs of Patanjali to explain yoga, while still stating that yoga actually comes from Egypt, while stating that Western yoga is crude and represents Indian yoga. It's a dizzying spin, and unfortunately shows less than thorough knowledge of the meaning of the Sanskrit words Kemetic teachers are using so liberally. I'm confused as to why one would refer to Patanjali at all if the practice originated in Kemet anyway. There must be a Cometian Patanjali, a pre-Patanjali Patanjali that compiled advanced psychological control instruction. By referring to Patanjali, Kemetic teachers show their awareness of what Indian yoga is, while again offering no clear example of an established yoga-like practice from ancient Egypt, or a Patanjali equivalent guru, all the while dismissing the development of yoga in India. Let's talk about the afterlife, the difference between the afterlives, okay? Compared to the enormous complexity and diversity of Indian religious development from Vedic times to modern Hinduism, Egyptian dynasties appear to have practiced a dynamic, supernaturally charged, yet less interdimensionally complex, more streamlined version of an initiation process into the afterlife. Like India, Egypt's version of a caste system was in full effect, so it wasn't like every Joe Blow got to participate in attempts at the afterlife. This is important. For most Egyptians, once you died, it was lights out. That was it. There was only afterlife for those who possessed knowledge. It is not like that in India. The primary afterlife concern in ancient Egypt was preparation for navigation through the afterworld called the duat, in the hopes of being deemed eligible to mingle with the gods. Most don't make it. Most don't know how to say the incantations or to have a scarab for putting over their heart to conceal any heaviness of their heart that might get them judged negatively by the gods. And if deemed unworthy by the gods, the soul is devoured by an alligator-headed god and lost for eternity. That is the end of you as anything in the creation. There's no perpetual self, there's no eternal self. This is it. An Egyptian aspirant, would spend much of their lifetime preparing and learning spells for the strange and treacherous journey through the duat, the afterlife. A process that, if successful, here's the big be-all, end-all of Egyptian mythology. If you make it through that duat, that afterworld, if you are successful, the end is eternal life as a prosperous farmer in the land of Ma'at, the mother goddess. That's it. That's the highest heavenly place you would go. To prepare for this, one would live in accordance with the Shittat Netter and practice the Shedi principles, which are simple and straightforward, and I listed them before at the beginning. Yet lacking any non-modern elaboration, I looked and looked to try to find some kind of non-modern, detailed elaboration of the Shedi, the principles. I about broke my brain trying to find it, and I did not find it. I don't think that it exists. That's always been the difference between yoga and all of the other mystic and religious practices I've studied, the details. No other system that I have found is as highly detailed, well developed, and specific about the practice and the goals. Another point to remember is that yoga is about purification through practice and meditation, not through rituals. And rituals are part of Egyptian spiritual life from beginning to end. I did not find a mystic liberation practice absent of ritual. Very importantly, too, the meditation processes between these two practices are very different. Yoga is so specific. Patanjali is so specific in his meditation requirements. Whereas teachers of Kemetic yoga routinely instruct students to visualize symbology during meditation, such as visualizing the Ankh. And Patanjali, Indian yoga does not allow that. The visualization component of our minds has to be shut down in meditation. The afterlife concepts of ancient Egypt and ancient India are so distinctive as to seem non-compatible. Short study of the Egyptian Book of the Dead will make that abundantly clear. Yoga is based on the principles of reincarnation, and understanding it is imperative to progress. Reincarnation. Here's another big difference. A yogi would never conceive that he or she would be returning to one's dead physical body for rebirth. Hence, the comparative lack of focus on physical preservation. A concept in Egyptian afterlife belief holds that one will return to one's physical corpse for rebirth. Hence, all of the preparation and the mummification and all of the things that they feel that they have to have around them. Indians generally cremate or put their bodies in the Ganges. And this would be unheard of in Egypt. So here's another point I wanted to bring up. No need for religion. This is a claim that these Egyptian yoga teachers make. Theoretically, one could make claim that the Hebrew 10 Commandments are a precursor to the yamas and niyamas of the Patanjali yoga system, or opposite way, vice versa. The Patanjali's yamas and niyamas are a precursor for the Hebrew 10 Commandments. Could that mean that ancient Judaism could be the origin of the yoga instructions? Maybe yoga started in Ethiopia or ancient Babylon. In a lecture by Ra-Un Nefer Amun, he stated that the Kemetic science was not considered religion in any way, that the African people had no need for religion. He defined religion as the binding of two things together, like ligaments bound to a bone, and you can see the root lig in the word religion. He claimed that the ancient Egyptian people had no need for any process that linked them to God because they were never separated from God in the first place. Therefore, there would be no need for a spiritual practice that yoked the two entities together. This one statement negates the entire purpose of yoga, yoking, harnessing of one's material energies and redirecting them to God. Yogis believe it takes discipline to remain connected to one's highest source. Now let's talk a little bit about literature. Vedic literature is profoundly diverse and is undoubtedly the world's largest pantheon of source texts, including the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, including the Bhagavad Gita, 18 Puranas, the Srimad Bhagavatam, which in chapter 5 details the layout of the interdimensional cosmos in a way never seen before or since, the Yoga Sutras, the Kundalini Hatha Yoga Pradipika, and more. It is the elaborate explaining of higher states of psychological control and transcendence that set Indian texts apart from all others and still does. So I sought in the remains of what humans have found thus far in the unearthing of the ever-curious and fantastic ancient Egypt, the existence of texts comparable to the high psychology and meditation requirements like those we find laid out by the ancient Vedic and Hindu culture. Did I find them? I didn't. No, not that I could find, and none of the teachers named ended up clearly naming any texts either. I listed the sources before that I used for my research, and if you feel that I've missed something, then please let me know. None of the stories or deity pastimes that I found from ancient Egypt correlate or are even similar enough to be considered possibly connected between mythology from ancient India and ancient Egypt. Even the languages are so dissimilar. The Medu-Neter and the Sanskrit, even pre-Sanskrit, they're so very, very different. So why call it yoga? Why do Kemetic yoga teachers call their classes yoga? Why not call it the word sema, S-E-M-A? So in closing, I address my last question. So if yoga did originate in Egypt, why use the word yoga at all? Why refer to the Indian Patanjali at all? Such a confusing contradiction that even the master teachers of Kemetic yoga trip over themselves with crisscross referencing between Egypt and, believe it or not, this happens a lot in their classes, crisscross referencing between Egypt and Greece, and with only quick reference to India, but lots to the 8 limbs of Patanjali and Indian. I learned far more from Kemetic yoga teachers about Egypt's connections with Greece and ideas about Atlantis than I did about Egypt's alleged migration of yoga to India. How did it get from Egypt to India if it originated in Egypt? Sema is the word in the Medu-Neter language that means union. And union is the way that Kemetic yoga teachers define yoga. Even though that's inaccurate, it should not be translated to the word union. It should be translated to the word restraint, but yet the Kemetic yoga teachers do translate the word yoga to the word union, and the word union in the Medu-Neter is sema. So why not use the word sema? Why not use the Medu-Neter language all the time for consistency and to honor the African practice as being complete on its own? It doesn't need any of these Indian words or references. Maybe the word yoga sells better. Maybe it's a trend trigger. That's why most people attach something to it, to make money off it and to collect adoring students. If I were a Kemetic yoga teacher, I would instruct myself to forget about yoga and to just teach the Shetty principles. I might call my classes Kemetic Shetty or the African Shetty, or offer yoga separately. Either way, I would be forced to accept, based on evidence, that they are 2 different practices, and that when attempted to be combined, the value of both is substantially lessened. I would find a teacher, a true wisdom teacher, to help me execute properly the Shetty. I would hunt down teachers who could translate Medu-Neter for me accurately and without bias. Netarianism would suffice me, and I would not try to justify it by adding another distinctly differing practice to it. I would not insult it by suggesting it needed something more added. I conclude each path is distinctive and should be practiced independent of each other, and with all due respect given by each to both. So my conclusion is that yoga did originate in ancient India, not in ancient Africa. I believe that the Shetty and the Shatat Natur are the 2 practices from ancient Kemet that can be practiced as an alternative to the Indian yoga. But I don't believe that the 2 have anything to do with each other. And I'd like to just say Shanti and Hotep.